Everyone knows that the government will look after your best interests. False. Pike River wasn't just a tragedy, it was a legal and moral failure, a miscarriage of justice that was preventable. 29 men died of systemic failure. Corporate negligence and government failure killed them. The evidence was everywhere: unsafe conditions, flawed decisions, regulatory failures, and those responsible were never held accountable. Not the company executives, not the government agencies, not a single person. Justice never came for the miners or their families. There was zero accountability. But here's the cruelest part: how they treated the families right after the explosion, and it'll make you angry. Pike River was doomed from the start. From day one, it was a geological nightmare: unstable ground, steep terrain, fractured rock, and above ground, the money was running out. Deadlines slipped, costs soared, and the urgency to start coal production pushed safety to the margins. Day one of the construction phase, they looked at the mountain and thought solid rock, so they skipped the geological tests, which saved them a heap of money and time. But then underground, the reality hit. 80% of the tunnel was fractured, unstable and dangerous. It had to be reinforced, bolted, meshed and sprayed with concrete just to hold it together. But they didn't stop there, because the drift to the tunnel was unusually long. Most mine tunnels are only a few hundred metres, but at Pike it was over 2 kilometres, which more than doubled the length and risk. And above ground it wasn't any better: steep terrain, dense forest and an 11-kilometre road needing multiple bridges. The final section of the road, as it was built, was on unstable ground, and this resulted in more delays, timelines were slipping, and the costs were skyrocketing. Pressure to get the mine running and revenue flowing began to outweigh caution. More and more corners were cut, and once unacceptable risks were now acceptable. Now, the ground beneath Pike River Mine was a disaster waiting to happen. It was inherently unpredictable. The Pike River Mine Company had to cut through the Hawea Fault, a 60-metre band of crushed and fractured rock. It took over 5 weeks of risky drilling and blasting just to get through. But it got worse. The terrain kept shifting and breaking, and that forced them to redesign everything. They built a brand new ventilation shaft right next to a fault zone. In February 2009, the ventilation shaft collapsed. It was choked with rocks and debris and was unusable. So they built another one, and in doing so made a fatal choice, placing the fan underground. This became the perfect recipe for New Zealand's deadliest mining disaster. This wasn't just misfortune, it was the predictable outcome of prioritising coal output over human lives. At Pike River, the rush to extract coal before safety systems were fully in place created the conditions where disaster wasn't just possible, but inevitable. Above ground, the project was dying. Delays everywhere and costs were exploding. Every stage of the mine construction was plagued with problems. The tunnel alone doubled the time and cost. It ballooned from an estimated $29 million to over $207 million between 2006 and 2009. That's 7 times over the budget. It was a financial disaster in the making, heading towards a human disaster. And this is the really strange thing, because all the managers came from Australia and they were used to flat coal seams. But at Pike River, the mine sloped uphill. The machines were underpad and struggled with the harsh conditions, and the risk didn't stop there. The mine's damp conditions disrupted methane detection, letting explosive concentrations of gas go unnoticed, and the machines, well, they were often broken down simply because they couldn't handle the terrain within the mine. Sometimes they would even spark small methane ignitions. Each ignition was a warning, each malfunction a missed opportunity, but no meaningful change was made, and so the danger grew near. Pike River's plan to extract coal relied on a risky combination of machinery and hydro mining. Now, hydro mining brings its own risks, and at Pike River, in the mine workings, it triggered southern collapses of the mine face. Each collapse released methane gas in surges, which made the mine conditions unpredictable and volatile. They were playing with dynamite every single day. Fresh air enters through the portal, the single intake of fresh air to the mine workings. It travels 2.3 kilometres down a tunnel to the mine workings and then exits vertically up the ventilation shaft. One circuit, one chance, and if that circuit broke, everyone dies. And that's exactly what Pike River Mine Company built. It was a death trap with no escape route. And what happened next? That was beyond negligence. In fact, it was sabotage by omission. At Pike River Mine, methane detection wasn't just inadequate, it was dangerously incomplete. On November 19, 2010, and that's the day of the explosion, only 8 methane sensors were working. That's 8 in the entire mine. Most were placed in the intake roadways, areas ventilated with fresh air, not where gas build-up was likely to occur. The few sensors in the return airways, where risk was highest, were often faulty and poorly installed. One was even tied to a rope, hanging in mud and water, hardly capable of giving reliable readings. Handheld methane detectors were also in short supply underground. Miners lacked the extension probes that they could use to test gas layers near the roof, where explosive concentrations tended to collect. According to international standards, like those used in Queensland, Australia, Pike River should have had multiple calibrated sensors in return airways, linked to alarms and automatic shutdown systems. But these safeguards were absent, and without them the men working underground were left exposed to danger that should have been detected and tragedy that should have been prevented. It was production first, safety last. Pike River Coal started hydro mining without safety assessments, without a working ventilation fan, without a second exit, and no safety net, no backup plan, and no way out. And they even introduced an employee production bonus program. More coal, more money for the miners. It trapped the miners in a cruel choice to either protect their lives or gamble them away for a few extra dollars. The conditions became even more explosive, and the Royal Commission had one word for this: reckless. And it gets worse. There was a high ratio of inexperienced to experienced workers. Many supervisors and key personnel who worked in the mine lacked the necessary qualifications or recent experience for their roles. The hydro mining coordinator, who had never previously worked as a hydro miner, was not qualified for the job. And here's why this matters. 1,000 incident reports, 1,000 warnings. How many investigated? 5. 5 out of 1,000. And what about the rest? Filed away, ignored, and forgotten. And what about those methane spikes? They were considered normal. Gas leaks, expected. And the equipment failures? Part of the job. Extreme risk was turned into routine practice because there were 1,000 chances to save lives, and 995 chances were simply thrown away. So what about the mine's health and safety manager? He was overlooked and under-resourced, actually ignored and sidelined. His warnings were dismissed. His department was powerless because senior management not only didn't just listen to him, they just simply did not care. And what about the safety systems on paper? Perfect? Absolutely. Safety systems in theory, non-existent in practice. Management had one job to do, and that was to keep the miners alive, and they failed. Behind the scenes there was chaos. Managers were leaving, technical staff were quitting, leadership, it was in a constant flux. Nobody knew who was responsible for what. And here's the most shocking part. There was no ventilation officer. Every mine in the world has one because it's legally required, except for at Pike River Mine. They just didn't bother. There was no government regulators, there was no government oversight, there wasn't any pretense of government oversight. Any oversight was completely distant and detached from the safety of the miners, and 29 men paid the price. If this makes you angry, subscribe, because this is how the system kills people and why justice never comes when it should. Pike River was not an accident. It was a predictable outcome of deregulation that saw the dismantling of safety systems. And this is how it happened. We'll start with 1879, where 34 miners were killed in the Kaitangata mine explosion, and it was because of the accumulation of methane gas. New Zealand's response to the Kaitangata disaster was to enact the Coal Mines Act in 1925 to protect miners. The Act provided very clear rules. There was strict enforcement by government agencies, and there were no exceptions. There were expert mine inspectors and specialist engineers who knew coal mining inside out, and their job was to prevent another Kaitangata. It worked for 67 years. Then in 1992, the then government repealed the Coal Mines Act, and it was replaced with guidelines which were non-specific, and they also shifted the responsibility of safety from government regulators to the employer, who now only has to take all practical steps towards safety. 67 years of safety knowledge was in an instance thrown away. Enforceable rules were now just suggestions, and then came the fatal blow. The Mines Inspectorate, it was gutted of its specialist staff. It was moved from one department and then defunded. The culture of safety was effectively destroyed. Oversight collapsed overnight. And this resulted in a shift in the political tide towards neoliberalism, which rewrote the rules, where market efficiency trumped human safety and deregulation paved the way for disaster. Government red tape was seen as getting in the way of corporations making money. Self-regulation became the norm, where companies policed themselves. Well, what could possibly go wrong there? People's safety was no longer mandatory, it was an optional extra. And this was engineered by the politicians to support the profits of companies over people. Hit the like button if you think that safety should never be for sale. The Royal Commission determined the cause of the disaster at Pike River Mine, a methane explosion, likely triggered by a roof fall that released gas from a mined-out void. Methane is an expected byproduct of coal mining, but Pike River's systems just simply couldn't cope because the ventilation was inadequate and the drainage of methane was insufficient, and the gas build-up began, unseen and unchecked. Then came the warning signs. In the final 48 days before the blast, there were 21 reports of explosive methane levels, 27 more registered dangerously high concentrations. These alerts came from the underground miners themselves, from the deputies who knew the risk that they were dealing with. They didn't just raise concerns about the gas, they flagged broader safety issues, hazards that could not be ignored, and yet they were. And the Royal Commission said it very clearly. These warnings were not heeded. There was no action, there was no meaningful response, and yet the mine continued to operate with these systems that could not handle the volume of methane being released. A methane explosion tore through Pike River Mine. Only 2 men made it out alive. Daniel Rockhouse and Russell Smith, they survived because they were lucky enough to be standing in the stone access tunnel or the drift far from the killing zone. The other 29 men were 1.5 kilometres deep near the coalface. They never stood a chance. Inside Pike River Coal, the executives knew that survival was impossible. The ground conditions in the mine were explosive, toxic and lethal. This left zero hope for the families, zero hope for survival. And yet, did they say anything to the families? No. Instead, they let hope grow. They even nurtured it with carefully worded statements, while families just clung to lies. Part of the reason why the families clung to hope was because across the world, a miracle was happening. In Chile, 33 miners trapped 700 metres down a mine were rescued. 69 days later, all 33 men were brought to the surface alive. The world watched in awe. If that could happen in Chile, maybe it could happen at Pike River, but it couldn't. The family's hope was misplaced. The Royal Commission's verdict was damning. Pike River management failed to communicate what they had already known. Families were left clinging to the possibility that their loved ones were still alive when that possibility never existed. The facts were brutal. The first explosion released lethal methane and carbon monoxide. The air became instantly unsurvivable without any way of extracting the dangerous gases. There was no communication, there was no movement, there was no sign of life. And 3 more explosions followed, each one hammering home the futility of any mine rescue. There was no viable rescue plan, there was no safe path into the mine, and there was no real chance anyone could survive. There was prolonged silence, official restraint, and sustained delusion. Yet the narrative to the public was kept alive. Then came the second explosion, the moment they could no longer hide the truth. It was too late, the damage was done. Not just underground, but in the hearts and minds of the families who had been deliberately misled by a callous and uncaring corporation that placed profits over people. To this day, no one has faced any criminal charges. The families still wait, not just for justice, but for basic honesty and acknowledgement of their ongoing suffering caused by a greedy corporation. We call tragedies like Pike River accidents, but when warning signs are ignored and safety is gutted and no one is held responsible, can we really call it an accident, or is it something else? If you're watching this and wondering how 29 lives could be lost without any justice, don't look away. Share this video, talk about it, and demand better, because if we forget Pike River, it'll happen again.